Hey friends, in this video we're talking about the sufficient amount of evidence for belief. Let's jump in. Hey friends, I'm Ash Leatherwood, your friendly neighborhood apologist. And on this channel we often talk about evidence for belief. And I think that as rational people we all want to have some amount of reason for what we believe. You know, we might grow up in certain circles, cultures where a certain belief or set of beliefs are encouraged and kind of grow up with them, but at some point we all need to come to a point where we ask ourselves, why do I believe what I believe? And we must come to belief that we have reason for. And there can be a variety of reasons for sure, like evidence is certainly one, you know, what are the reasons I think this is true, but there might also be cultural reasons or familial reasons, like this is what my family believes or this is what my culture enforces, you know, there are different reasons. But at some point we all need to come back to this reason of why do I believe what I believe? And the question is, what is the sufficient amount of evidence for this belief? You know, we can often be hyper skeptical about things. Be like, you know, I'm never going to believe until I have this amount of evidence. So that's the ultimate question that we're tackling in this video. What is the bar, you know? At what point do we gain a sufficient amount of evidence for a belief? And I think that's really the point, because ultimately it becomes purely arbitrary. For each person, that bar is going to be in a different place. For someone who's hyper skeptical about everything, the bar is going to be way up here that they're never going to believe until they reach this point, and that's the sufficient amount of evidence. And you know, maybe they don't even have a bar. You know, maybe there's no amount of evidence that could be sufficient for them. Whereas for someone else, maybe they were raised in a belief and they don't really have much value for reasons for that belief. So maybe their bar is way down here when it comes to the sufficient amount of evidence for what they believe. Maybe they don't need any evidence. Maybe they're into blind faith and they don't need any evidence for what they believe. So the bar is way down here. So the question is, for you, where is the bar on sufficient evidence? Because it's not just clear cut for everyone. I don't think you can even make it clear cut for yourself. And until we really ask ourselves this question, we might just endlessly ask questions, but never actually consider where we are at and the evidence that we have. Because as rational people, we need to not just seek answers, but also recognize the answers that we've gained and what that means about the things we're asking questions about. So, for example, me as a Christian, the ultimate question is, did Jesus actually rise from the dead, right? Does God exist? Those are two big questions that I might ask as someone who's interested in Christianity. And the question is, what's the sufficient amount of evidence for me to actually choose to believe it? And that's where we realize that belief isn't purely just intellectual. You know, it's not just finding answers to questions. At some point, you have to turn and actually choose to believe it. There's a volitional element within beliefs that you actually have to choose to believe something. If someone doesn't want to believe something, then there's going to be no amount of evidence that's going to be sufficient to make them believe it. You know, you can't force someone to believe something that they don't want to believe. I, as a Christian, can't force someone to believe Christianity if they really just don't want to believe Christianity. In the same way, you can't convince someone to become a Muslim if they don't want to become a Muslim. Or you can't convince someone to be an atheist if they don't want to be an atheist. So that's where there's that volitional element. And that volition is going to really determine where that sufficiency bar is. In the same way, if I want to be a Christian, then my bar might be really low on the sufficiency scale, you know? I might need very little evidence to, choose to be a Christian. And the same way, if you want to be an atheist, then probably the bar is going to be really low for you to believe in philosophical naturalism, that the natural world is all that exists. Or if you want to be a Muslim, then in the same way, probably the sufficiency bar is going to be really low. You're not going to need a lot of evidence to actually choose to be a Muslim. So you need to ask yourself, what are you more inclined to believe? Due to your background, your upbringing, your culture, just so that you can be aware of places that might be blind spots in your life that you might actually demand less evidence than you might in other areas. So I grew up in Christian circles, so I need to ask myself, am I more inclined to believe Christianity? Not just because I have evidence for it, but just because, I want it to be true. And, it's okay to actually want something to be true. I think that's natural. I think that's even something to ask about. What do our hearts long for, and what worldview best fulfills that and gives us that? Because I think that can be an argument in and of itself. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that, there are so many people with different views, and they want their views to be true, but they can't all be right. There are Muslims who want their beliefs to be true, there are Christians who want their beliefs to be true, there are Hindus who want their beliefs to be true, and there are atheists who want their beliefs to be true. They don't want there to be a God. They don't want to be subject to his rules and his judgment. So all of us, to some extent, have a belief that we want to be true. So we each need to recognize that we come into the conversation with that. And when we recognize that, I think that'll help us realize, maybe I should be asking more questions about the belief I have. Maybe I should demand more evidence for the belief that I have, Do I actually have a sufficient amount of evidence to be this firm in my belief? Because the ultimately true belief, there should be a good amount of reason to believe that it's true. It shouldn't be blind faith. So none of us should come into our own beliefs with this low sufficiency bar that, I really don't need any evidence. Because the will for something to be true alone isn't going to make it true, I can't just make something true by wanting it to be true. I can't fly just because I want to fly. I grew up, I love Peter Pan. I wanted to be Peter Pan as a little kid. But that obviously didn't make it true. And that's a silly example. But at the same time, me just wanting Christianity to be true doesn't make it true. So what are actual sufficient reasons to think that it's true? Well, I'm going to get into arguments for God's existence. I'm going to get into arguments for the historical figure of Jesus and his life, death, and supposed resurrection. The question is, what is going to be the sufficient amount of evidence? So that's the first part. Where am I coming from? And what are places that I've set the bar too low on sufficient evidence? What are these blind spots that I've just taken for granted and assumed? What questions should I be asking to make sure that, the belief that I have is justified? But at the same time, we don't want to go to the other extreme and set the bar too high when it comes to sufficient evidence. So the first question was, where do I come from and what am I more inclined to want to be true? Now the second question is, where do I come from and what am I less inclined to want to be true? In other words, what do I want to not be true? For me coming from Christian circles, maybe that's atheism, or maybe for Christian circles that's me and Islam. I don't want Islam to be true. But at the same time, just as me wanting something to be true doesn't make it true, me not wanting something to be true doesn't make it not true. So we make sure that we're not setting the bar too high on other views and too low on our views, because that's just hypocritical, I'm not going to demand this much from somebody else if I'm not doing that much for my own view, I'm not going to cross-examine someone else's view to this degree if I'm not even doing that to my own view, my view's down here. So we just want to be, we want to have integrity in the way that we cross-examine views. And I think it's great to be skeptical about other views. I think it's great to ask great questions and to really look for good justification for others' views. But the point is, we should do the same to other views as we do to ourselves, You might even connect that to what Jesus said, the golden rule, do to others what you'd have them do unto you. We should ask people great questions. We should do that with grace, We want other people to believe what is true. We don't want them to end up living for a lie and have to live with the consequences of that. There are consequences to not knowing the truth, If, I'm a Christian, and if my friend Fred isn't a Christian, and if I'm right and he's wrong, he's going to live the eternal consequences of that by being separated from God forever. But, if I'm a Christian and my friend Fred's an atheist and he turns out to be true, then sure, to some extent, I've lived my life for something that isn't true. I could have used it other ways. There are consequences for getting the truth wrong, and some are more serious than others. But the point is, we should want to believe the truth, and we should want other people to believe the truth as well. So we should be asking good questions to other people about their beliefs, but we should be asking those same questions for ourselves. So the ultimate question is, what is your standard? What is your bar for sufficient evidence? What is the sufficient evidence for you to believe what you think is true? How is that affecting the way that you view your own beliefs, Are you walking into your beliefs, asking these questions with too low of a bar, too high of a bar, or a rational bar for sufficient evidence? And how are you walking into other people's beliefs with that bar of sufficient evidence, As other people try to tell you about what they believe, and sure, to some extent persuade you of it, are you walking in with too high of a bar for them, Are you demanding too much of them? Are you demanding too little of them? Or is it a rational amount? At the end of the day, we need to recognize and decide for ourselves what is rational, sufficient evidence for belief. I think that there is sufficient evidence to believe that God exists. I think that the origin of the universe points to a cause outside the universe. I think that the fine-tuning of the universe points to design and purpose towards the universe, and particularly Earth, to sustain life. I think that the origin and complexity of life points to direct intentionality and a designer. I think that the existence of moral values point to the fact that there must be some amount of objective moral laws, and that comes from a lawgiver. There can't be moral values that are above all people unless there's a judge above all people. And I think even just the search for meaning and purpose and beauty in the world points to this other aspect of the world, that there must be something more than just accidental processes and entities. So I think that there's sufficient reason to believe that God exists. I think there's sufficient reason to believe that Jesus was a real guy. I think that we can all recognize that the majority of historians recognize Jesus as a guy who actually lived 2,000 years ago. And you might say, oh, sure, okay, fine, but that doesn't prove the gospel. Absolutely. But that being said, I think that there's good reason to believe that the testimonies, the gospels, were written by the eyewitnesses, that he actually said these things, he claimed these things. That's why he was put to death on the cross, because of the outrageous things he claimed and how he understood himself. And I think that there's good reason to believe that these witnesses actually saw him risen 3 days later, because they were willing to go to death for what they claimed. And they claimed that Jesus was risen from the dead. What transforms someone in such a radical way that they're willing to die for their belief? You know, people are willing to die every day for what they think is true. But eyewitnesses would know if it's false. And no one's willing to die for something they know to be false. So I think there's sufficient reason to believe that Jesus existed. You need to decide for yourself, what is the sufficient evidence that I need to believe Christianity is true? And that's where it comes back to your volition, your will. Do you want it to be true? Do you want it to not be true? Are you coming into the discussion of Jesus with too low of a standard? You know, maybe you've taken these beliefs for granted, you've just assumed them, and you know, maybe you actually don't have good grounding for your belief in Jesus. Maybe you want to learn more about that. You know, what are the reasons for this belief? If that's you, then I recommend you stick around the channel, watch more of my content. I think that there are good reasons to believe Christianity is true, and we talk through that in various videos. But maybe you're walking the discussion of Jesus with too high of a standard, you know, that's just irrational, that you wouldn't demand this much evidence from any other area in life. And maybe it's just because you don't want Christianity to be true, because you don't want the implications that would come with that onto your life. And maybe you need to think about that and, you know, ask, okay, well, what's the amount of evidence that I demand in other areas? If Jesus actually was who he said he was, what might I expect the evidence to be that's left over, you know? Ask yourself those questions. Ultimately, we just want to find that middle ground. What's a rational, sufficient evidence to expect and look for something like this to be true? So that's my challenge for you guys. I think it's something helpful to think about, not just when it comes to religion, but other areas of life as well. So definitely just think about that this week and try to apply that to your conversations with others and your own beliefs as well. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, then please subscribe for more content just like this every week. Send this video to someone that you think would be challenged and encouraged by this. And having said that, see you guys next time.